All right, Randy. So is estate planning only about what happens with assets or children or things when you've passed away?
No. And here's what a lot of people don't understand. Okay, again, think of the advantages of will and a trust. You know, a will it's cheap and easy initially. A trust is more expensive to set up because, number one, you have more flexibility after you die, but also before you die, if you become disabled, you can dictate in the trust what's going to happen. Yeah. So you have that flexibility to do some planning ahead of time. And when you start doing the planning, you have to start looking at your circumstances all the way across the board. Elderly people come in and they need Medicaid planning more frequently than they realize. If they're looking at going into a nursing home in the very near future, usually within a couple, 3 weeks, it's considered to be crisis planning. And you have to do some Medicaid planning so that they don't spend down all of their assets and then get on Medicaid.
Yeah, that's interesting to think about. So I've never thought a lot about Medicaid planning at all. Do most people know that you need planning?
No.
Okay.
No,
I figured
they don't.
Mom has a stroke or something like that. We need assisted living. We apply for Medicaid. But
yeah. See, and there are some things. Okay. Lots of rules and just to go over the rules in general, when you apply for Medicaid, number one, Medicaid covers care in a nursing home. It does not cover assisted living facilities or independent living facilities. You have to pay for that on your own. To qualify for Medicaid, the individual going into the nursing home can only have $2,000 in assets, plus assets that are considered exempt. So if you have a house and an intent to return to the house, or a spouse or minor or disabled child living in it, that is an exempt asset. One car is an exempt asset. Your furnishings and personal property are considered exempt assets. But then if you have savings or 401ks and IRAs, that all has to be spent down. And if you're single, you can only keep $2,000. If you've got more than that, you don't qualify for Medicaid until you've spent it down. And the reason you need Medicaid planning, Medicaid and Medicare don't cover all of the costs. Okay, I've had a nursing home administrator who told me many months ago that she has several patients, and I don't know how many that is, but several patients at a nursing home who, if they could get 5 days of occupational therapy every day for 3 or 4 weeks, for 5 days a week for 3 or 4 weeks, they could go home. But Medicaid and Medicare will only pay for 5 days.
Whew.
So if you can pay for the additional need, you could be off of Medicaid.
Yeah.
So
better quality of life,
better quality of life, saving money for both them and the government. Lots of advantages, but the system isn't set up that way. And so what we try to do, we need to, and that's just one example of where you think needs can come up and they're not covered by the government. So if you spend your assets down to $2,000, how do you get those benefits that you need? You can't.
Yeah.
You stay in the nursing home because you don't have enough money to pay for the care you need that would get you out.
Yeah.
That's why you do Medicaid planning. And if you're married, the spouse can keep whatever income they have. If their income is below a certain level, then some of the income from the spouse going into the nursing home can be transferred over, and so they have a minimum amount to live on.
Yeah.
So there are lots of rules that you have to follow, but that Medicaid planning can be an important part because if you do proper planning, we can generally preserve 40 to 80 or 90% of the estate from having to be spent down.
Interesting. Yeah. How long does that take? I mean, I assume if someone needs to go into a nursing home, they don't have 4 weeks.
Yeah, no, you can usually get the planning in place within a week or 10 days.
Wow, that's awesome.
If everybody gets their signatures and gets things, they have to be on top of things. They can't delay like they do sometimes.
So question for you, because I originally used the word assisted living, and you said it'll pay for a nursing home, not assisted living.
Right.
What's the difference?
Okay, the level of care that's required.
Okay, and nursing homes more care.
Okay. You have to have more care. You have 5 activities of daily living, and you have to have help in at least 2 of those. So bathing, mobility, dressing, cooking, eating, things like that. If you have to qualify for a nursing home level of care, you have to require help in at least 2 of those 5.
Okay, interesting. That's really interesting to know. So a place that is called an assisted living place, if they're providing 3 of those 5, could qualify, or maybe not.
No, because you'd have to be in a nursing home set up to this.
Interesting.
And so a lot of the people in the assisted living facilities don't qualify for Medicaid, and Medicaid just doesn't cover, so they have to go into a nursing home.
Interesting, and it's just the classification of the place and the number of items they need care for. Interesting.
We do have a program for assisted living facilities, but you have to self-pay for a year, and then you can go through a process and get qualified into that program. It's similar to Medicaid, but not exactly the same.
Interesting.
You don't think you have to qualify, but I know some attorneys that do Medicaid planning don't deal with that program just because you don't have guarantees that they're going to get
Right.
in
Yeah,
if they qualify.
Interesting.
So
Yeah. How often would you say, percentage-wise or numbers, how common is it to have Medicaid planning that becomes a part of an estate plan?
not as often as it should. A lot of the people in nursing homes, they've spent everything down, and then they get on Medicaid. And if I would bet half of them, if they would, maybe I don't know, because a lot of people, if they would come in and do some planning, we could preserve even $50 or $60 or $70,000 for them.
Yeah, well, even with things of like pre-gifting to beneficiaries.
Yeah, you have to be careful with that because there's a 5-year look back.
Oh,
So
interesting.
you can see when you apply for Medicaid, they're going to go back and see if you have made any gifts.
Shifted assets and gifting. Interesting.
They'll look
Okay.
back 5 years.
So there's a lot going into it. It's not
it's not something you do off the cuff. You have to
Yeah.
put some thought and planning into it.
So when an elderly person is looking at estate planning, they don't have any major medical problems yet. They're not needing assisted
don't need
living
assisted living.
or nursing home yet. I mean, how far in advance do you start thinking, what if?
Okay, and that's a good question. The problem we have, when you do Medicaid planning, it's like an insurance policy. You don't know if you're ever going to need it.
Right.
And that people don't want to pay. It's expensive to do Medicaid planning because there's a lot more involved than just simple estate planning for, and even tax planning for wealthy people. But the goal of estate planning is to maintain ownership and control and have flexibility. The goal of Medicaid planning is to get assets out of your name and control, but still have somebody that can use those assets to pay for things that you need.
Yeah.
And so the goals are almost the opposite.
Yeah.
When you start doing, again, most of the time people will come in, they're looking at going into a nursing home in the very immediate future, and that's when they start doing Medicaid planning, and that's okay because you do it planning. Well, they're not gonna need it for 5 years. You don't know that.
Right. Yeah.
And so you do the planning, and then you have to be careful. But also, they may never need to go to a nursing home.
Yeah.
I mean, all of us know somebody in their late 80s or early 90s who's doing just fine at home.
Yeah.
And so they may never need to go into a nursing home. And people don't want to pay the high fees for Medicaid planning when they may never need it.
Right. But it sounds like when the need does arise, it still is doable and certainly better than not doing anything.
Yes. And I tell clients, you don't ever apply for Medicaid until you've at least talked to an elder law attorney to see if there's a plan that can be put in place to preserve some assets that can pay for the things that are not covered.
And it sounds like a lot of people who don't have health planning, they just pay the 7, 8, 9, 10, 12,000 a month until they have nothing, and then go in.
Then they go on Medicaid.
And then they can't ever get off at that point.
Yeah.